When winter came into Cherokee country, our people didn't always ask one house to do everything. That's something most folks have forgotten. In some of the old Cherokee towns, a family could have one place for the warm months and another only a few steps away, built for the cold. Think about the work behind that. Every post had to be cut by hand. Timber had to be carried, walls had to be built, and a roof came from the land around you, not from a truck pulling into the yard. So nobody went through all that trouble just because they wanted another building sitting beside the first one. There was a reason, and that reason tells you something important about the way Cherokee people learned to live with the seasons instead of expecting every season to behave the same way. When the cold settled into the valleys and mountains, the answer wasn't necessarily to keep feeding a larger fire inside the same warm weather structure. The living space itself could change. One building answered the needs of warmer weather. The winter house was different, more enclosed, organized around a hearth, and built for a completely different problem. That's what caught my attention, because today most of us build one house and spend the entire year trying to make the inside feel almost the same. When it's hot, we cool it. When it's cold, we heat it. But an older Cherokee approach could begin with another question, not, how do I force this house to work the same way all year? But what kind of space does this season require? And centuries after those buildings disappeared, the ground at places like Chota and Cherokee still carries evidence that this really happened. The southern Appalachians aren't the Arctic. Nobody needs to exaggerate the climate to make this story interesting. Winter there can still be cold, wet, windy, and uncomfortable, especially when you're living without modern insulation, furnaces, synthetic clothing, or a thermostat hanging on the wall. A household in the 18th century had to solve those problems with the materials available around it: wood, earth, fire, and experience. Summer created almost the opposite challenge. A space that lets air move can be useful when the weather is hot and humid. That same openness becomes less helpful when cold air starts moving through your living space. So the question wasn't simply how to build a good house. It was what made a good house in July, and whether that same design still made sense in January. At Cherokee, an 18th century overhill Cherokee town in what is now Tennessee, archaeologists found evidence of winter and summer domestic structures standing near each other. The winter dwelling was circular and enclosed, with a hearth near its center. Nearby was a rectangular structure associated with warmer weather. Those weren't two copies of the same house. They served different purposes. And once you understand that, the whole idea starts to make sense. A warm season structure could take advantage of openness. The winter space could reduce exposure and organize the household around a central source of heat. The solution wasn't necessarily a more complicated building. It was a more specialized one. That's a distinction I think we sometimes miss when we look backward. We tend to judge old buildings by how closely they resemble ours. How big was it? How thick were the walls? How comfortable would it have been? But those questions can hide the intelligence behind the arrangement. The people building these structures weren't trying to create an 18th century version of a modern suburban house. They were solving the problems in front of them. At Chota, another major overhill Cherokee town in Tennessee, archaeologists found post holes belonging to a domestic winter structure. Post holes don't look like much when you first see them. The building itself is gone. The wood decayed a long time ago. But when substantial posts stand in the ground for years, they can leave traces behind. Map those traces carefully, and the footprint of a vanished building begins to return. You can see where the support stood. You can reconstruct the general shape. Sometimes you can identify the hearth. The Chota winter structure was circular, with central supports helping hold the building above it. And evidence from Cherokee settlements shows rectangular warm weather structures associated nearby. For me, the important thing isn't memorizing the measurements. It's recognizing the decision behind them. Somebody planned ahead for the season to change. The winter space wasn't an emergency repair added after the cold arrived. It was part of the household. That changes the way I see the whole settlement. When warm weather returned, daily life didn't have to remain trapped inside a winter arrangement that no longer made sense. And when temperatures dropped again, the household had a space suited to those conditions. The architecture moved with the year. Now imagine entering the winter house. Near the center is the hearth. That position matters because the fire isn't pushed off into some forgotten corner. People can arrange themselves around it. Heat begins in the middle of the occupied space. The building surrounding that hearth is also different from the more open, warm season structure nearby. Anyone who has spent time outdoors understands the difference without needing a scientific explanation. Stand beside a fire on a calm night, and it can feel wonderful. Let the wind start cutting across that same fire, and suddenly you're constantly turning your body, protecting one side while the other cools. Put a protected space around the people and the fire, and the situation changes. Not because the flame became magical, because exposure changed. That's why I don't want to turn these winter houses into some kind of lost technological miracle. We don't know the exact temperature inside a particular house on a January night in the 18th century. We don't have a Cherokee thermometer buried beside the hearth telling us how many degrees warmer it became. And we don't need one to understand the basic logic. The building used for winter differed from the building associated with warmer weather. The winter structure was enclosed around a central hearth. That alone tells us the builders were responding deliberately to the season. Then we get another piece of the story from a man named William Bartram. Bartram traveled through Cherokee country in the 18th century and wrote about what he saw. He was an outsider, so his words have to be treated as the observations of a visitor, not as if he were speaking for Cherokee people. But one detail in his account is especially useful. When describing Cherokee domestic buildings, Bartram wrote about another smaller conical structure standing near the main dwelling. He referred to it as a winter or hothouse and described earth as part of its covering. Now that becomes interesting when you put it beside the archaeology. A traveler records a separate structure associated with winter. Much later, archaeologists find physical traces of distinct seasonal domestic buildings at Cherokee sites. Neither piece of evidence answers every question by itself. Together, they make the picture harder to ignore. And Sitico gives us one of the clearest examples. There, archaeologists documented the footprints of both kinds of domestic space. One was circular, the other was rectangular. They existed close to one another, but their forms tell us they weren't intended to do exactly the same job. If you were standing there in the 18th century, you wouldn't have seen archaeological diagrams. You would have seen buildings. You would have seen people carrying wood, tending a fire, preparing food, repairing tools, talking, sleeping, and moving through their ordinary lives. Then the season would turn. That household wouldn't have to discover winter from the beginning every year. They already knew it was coming. They had lived through it before. Their parents had lived through it. Their grandparents had lived through it. The landscape had already taught the lesson many times. The house was part of the response. That's what makes the second building so interesting to me. It wasn't there because somebody failed to build the first one correctly. It existed because one design didn't need to be forced into solving two opposite problems equally well. That's not waste. That's planning. There is a temptation with stories like this to turn them into a simple argument that everything old was better. I don't believe that. Modern housing can provide safety and comfort on a level people in the 18th century could hardly have imagined. I enjoy walking into a warm room on a cold morning as much as anybody, but comfort can make us forget the decisions that used to happen before the technology stepped in. Today, if a room is cold, we usually add heat. If it's hot, we remove heat. We expect the same walls to stay where they are while machines change the conditions inside them. The seasonal Cherokee arrangement asks us to look at the problem from the other direction. If the conditions change, maybe the way you occupy the land changes too. That mindset appears again when archaeologists look at the larger layout of historic Cherokee settlements. Seasonality wasn't some tiny detail hidden inside one unusual house. Different spaces could answer different times of the year, and that makes sense when daily life depends closely on weather, daylight, crops, hunting, firewood, and the rhythm of the land around you. You don't have to defeat the season. You prepare for it. There's another piece of archaeological evidence I particularly like because it takes us closer to one actual winter house. In 2009, archaeologists working in Great Smoky Mountains National Park completed excavation work at the remains of a Cherokee winter structure near Newfound Gap Road. Inside the site, they recovered material connected with the hearth along with ceramics, beads, animal remains, and projectile points. Those objects bring the building back down to human scale. It wasn't an architectural concept. People were there. They ate. They worked. They used tools. They maintained a fire. And that fire left something behind. Burned material can preserve information archaeologists use to understand when a site was occupied. So centuries after the last flames went out, the hearth was still helping researchers reconstruct the life of the building around it. I find that remarkable. Not because archaeology makes the past mysterious, almost the opposite. It makes the past ordinary again. You stop seeing ancient people as some distant idea and begin seeing a household. Somebody had to get up and tend that fire. Somebody had to carry the fuel inside. Somebody sat near it when the weather turned cold. Maybe somebody complained there wasn't enough wood. Maybe a child wanted to sit closer. We don't know those conversations, and I won't invent them. But the objects tell us people were living real lives inside that space. And that's enough. The house eventually disappeared. The wooden supports decayed. The people who knew that building by sight were gone. But the hearth remained beneath the ground. So did the post holes. And when those traces are combined with what archaeologists found at Chota, Sitico, and other Cherokee sites, the seasonal pattern becomes visible again. Now, I want to make an important distinction. We should not take evidence from one Cherokee town in one period and pretend it tells us exactly how every Cherokee family lived everywhere. Cherokee communities covered a wide region. Building practices could change from place to place and through time. Families had different needs. Materials changed. European contact also changed the physical world around Cherokee communities. History doesn't stay still. So when I talk about these winter and summer structures, I'm talking about practices that are actually documented in particular historic Cherokee contexts. I think being specific makes the story stronger. We don't have to claim everybody did something for the evidence to matter. What happened at these places is already worth understanding. And by now, that original question has a pretty good answer. Why would a Cherokee household spend the labor to build a second structure when another stood only a few steps away? Because the second structure wasn't redundant. It answered another season. A more open warm weather space and a more enclosed winter space were doing different work, but I don't think the real lesson is the shape of the winter house. It's not the diameter. It's not the number of posts. It's not even the hearth. What stays with me is the willingness to let the environment influence the way people lived. Winter arrived and life adjusted. Summer returned and life adjusted again. That sounds simple, maybe too simple. But simple decisions repeated generation after generation are often what practical knowledge looks like. There isn't always a dramatic secret. Sometimes somebody just notices what works and remembers it. And the next generation doesn't have to start from zero. That is one reason I'm careful with words, like primitive when people talk about old housing. A structure can look simple and still represent generations of decisions. Where should the fire go? How enclosed should the winter space be? What arrangement makes sense when the weather changes? Which building should be used when the warm months return? Those questions were being answered long before anybody arrived with an archaeological notebook. When I look at the old footprints from Chota and Sitiko, I don't see people failing to build one house that could do everything. I see people choosing not to ask one building to do everything. There's a difference. And that difference may be the most interesting part of this whole story. Imagine having to build every part of your home yourself. You have to select the wood, cut it, move it, set the supports, maintain the roof, gather the fuel that will keep the hearth burning. Every design decision eventually becomes labor. Under those conditions, a second structure might sound wasteful at first, until you realize that specialization can also simplify things. The summer space doesn't need to pretend it is a winter house. The winter house doesn't need to be designed around a hot Appalachian afternoon. Each one can answer the conditions it was meant to face. We still use that logic in other parts of life. We don't wear the same clothing in every season. We change blankets. We change routines. We eat differently. We work differently. The old Cherokee domestic arrangement reminds us that architecture could be part of that same seasonal rhythm. And maybe that's what has really been forgotten. Not how to reproduce one particular old building, but the habit of paying close enough attention to a place that your way of living changes with it. If you could stand in Chota centuries ago, you would see a busy Cherokee town where today we mostly have archaeological traces. You would hear voices instead of explanations. You would smell smoke instead of reading reports about hearths. Those circular and rectangular patterns beneath the soil would be actual buildings standing in front of you. The second house wouldn't look strange. It would simply make sense. Winter was coming. That was reason enough. Today, we have to reconstruct that logic from what survived. A post hole, a hearth, a pattern in the soil, an old written description, evidence from another Cherokee town. Piece by piece, they bring back a practical decision that was once ordinary. And that's why I wanted to tell this story. Because sometimes what disappears isn't some great secret. Sometimes it's an ordinary habit that stopped being necessary. And once it stopped being necessary, people slowly stopped remembering why it had made sense. So if you had to build your home entirely by hand, using what the land around you provided, and every post you set represented hours of your own labor, what would you choose? Would you build one larger house and try to make it handle every season? Or would you build two simpler spaces, each suited to a different part of the year? I'd genuinely like to know which one makes more sense to you, because those two old house patterns in Cherokee country don't just show us how people built centuries ago. They show us something more interesting. When winter changed the problem, they were willing to change the house.